For about 18 months, I had an explanation for everything. My career wasn't moving because my boss played favorites. My relationships kept going wrong because people were unreliable. My goals kept collapsing because life kept throwing things at me at the wrong time. Every failure had a reason, and none of the reasons were me. I thought I was being realistic. I wasn't. I was stuck and felt lost. And the mental framework I built to protect myself from that fact was the exact thing making sure it stayed true. So before I get into the actual mechanisms, because there are specific psychological things happening here that nobody explains properly, I want to say something about what victim mentality actually is. Because the way most people talk about it is wrong. And if you go in the wrong frame, none of this makes sense. It's not weakness. It's not laziness. Or even a character flaw. It's a defense mechanism. Your brain built it for a reason. Here's the thing that changed how I saw this completely. When you're in a victim mentality, when you're attributing everything to circumstances outside your control, your brain isn't malfunctioning. No, it's doing something actually quite clever, in a horrible way. If nothing is your fault, you never have to face the possibility that you tried your absolute hardest and still failed. That's the thing it's protecting you from. Not failure, the idea that maybe you genuinely gave it everything and it still didn't work. That's terrifying. In a way that's hard to explain unless you have sat with it. So your brain goes, right, let's not find that out. Let's just make sure there's always something else to blame. And it works. In the short term, it genuinely works. But right, I need to explain what's actually happening neurologically first. Otherwise, the solution won't make sense. There's a concept in psychology called learned helplessness. The basic idea is this. When you repeatedly face situations where your actions don't seem to produce results, where you try and nothing changes, your brain stops trying. Even when the circumstances shift, even when trying would actually work. It's learned that effort is pointless, and it acts accordingly. The prefrontal cortex, which is where your goal-directed thinking lives, essentially stops generating options. Why analyze what went wrong if you couldn't have changed it? Why look for solutions if the problem is external? That's the cost nobody mentions when they're trying to tell you, take responsibility. It's not just that victim mentality feels bad. It shuts down the learning mechanism. You stop growing. Not because you're giving up, but because your brain has genuinely concluded that growth isn't in your control. I thought about this a lot after my mate said something to me in the pub that actually got to me for a week. I'd be venting, I don't even remember what it was about, some situation at work, and he just listened. And then he said, "You're right about all of it, and you're going to stay exactly where you are." Not just cruel, just factual. I was furious. And then about 3 days later, I realized he was right, and I hated that. So there are 3 things I want to go through. The secondary gains, what victim mentality is actually giving you. Locus of control piece, which is genuinely one of the most researched psychological factors for long-term outcomes, and almost nobody talks about it properly. And the identity trap, which is the one that kept me stuck the longest and is probably the hardest to see when you're in it. Right, let's do secondary gains first. This is the bit I find dead interesting, because it completely reframed why this pattern is so hard to break. Victim mentality isn't just protecting you from responsibility. It's actually giving you things. Real things. When you position yourself as helpless or dealt a bad hand, people respond with sympathy, with support, with lowered expectations. You get emotional connection through shared grievance. You get a pass on standards that other people are held to. These aren't imaginary benefits. Your brain does notice them, and it associates the victim narrative with receiving them. I'll be honest. When I first properly sat with this, when I actually wrote down what victim mentality was giving me, I was a bit uncomfortable with the list. Sympathy from people I cared about, lower expectations at work that I was quietly relieved by, a reason for every disappointment that meant I didn't have to look at myself too hard. None of it was conscious. That's the bit that gets me. I wasn't doing it on purpose, I was doing it. And once you see that, you can ask yourself the actual question. Are these gains worth what I'm giving up? For me, they weren't. I had to see them first. If you try to break out of the victim mentality without acknowledging what it's doing for you, You're trying to stop a behavior without understanding why you started it. And that does not work. Second thing, locus of control. This is probably the most predictive psychological factor for long-term outcomes that most people have never heard of. The concept is straightforward. Eternal locus of control. You believe your actions significantly influence what happens to you. External locus of control. You believe outcomes are mostly determined by luck, circumstance, or other people. Here's what the data shows, and this is consistent across decades of research across different countries and contexts. People with eternal locus of control earn more, report higher life satisfaction, and have a better physical health, recover faster from setbacks, and build stronger relationships. One thing that stopped me in my tracks when I read about this, in a massive long-term study using data from over 80 countries, locus of control predicted life satisfaction more strongly than health status, employment, income, or martial status. More than income, more than health. The people who believe they have agencies actually create better outcomes, even when they're facing identical circumstances to people who don't. And here's the mechanism. When you believe your actions matter, your brain stays in problem-solving mode. You hit an obstacle, and instead of stopping, you ask, what else can I try? That question, that's everything. Victim mentality switches it off. If the obstacle proves your helplessness, there's no point asking what else you could try. Self-efficacy is the specific belief that your actions will produce the results you want, factors, and every time you attribute a failure to external, unchangeable factors, which is every time you blame circumstances, you're eroding it. You're teaching your brain, slowly, that what you do doesn't matter. Grit. In the psychological sense, persistence in the face of obstacles requires believing that continued effort will eventually produce different results. Victim mentality and grit are incompatible. One says action doesn't matter, the other says my actions compound over time. You can't hold both. Third thing, the identity trap. This is the one that kept me stuck the longest. Victim mentality doesn't just describe your circumstances after a while. It becomes who you are. The stories we tell about ourselves shape our behavior. That's not a vague self-help claim. It's what research into narrative identity constantly shows. If your story about yourself is someone things happen to, your brain will unconsciously avoid situations where you'd have to be someone who makes things happen. Because succeeding in those situations would contradict your story, and changing your story feels like losing yourself. I watched this happen to me in real time once. I could see it. Opportunities would come up and I'd find reasons why they weren't real or wouldn't work out. Not because I was lazy, because somewhere underneath it, succeeding would mean admitting I'd been wrong about my own narrative for a long time. My brain preferred familiar suffering to unfamiliar success. I know how that sounds, but I think if you're honest with yourself, if you've been in this pattern, you'll recognize it. Rumination feeds it. Every time you replay how you were wronged, how things were unfair, how circumstances conspired against you, you're not just dwelling. You're training your brain to see yourself as powerless. You're building neural pathways that make external attributions more automatic next time. The victim who replays past grievances constantly isn't being dramatic. The brain is genuinely strengthening the pattern. Rumination and learned helplessness reinforce each other. That's the loop. Now I can only speak to what's actually broke it for me, and what the psychological mechanism suggests. I'm not saying this is the only way through, but here's what worked. The first thing was acknowledging the secondary gains. I wrote a proper list. Everything victim mentality was giving me, once I could see it, I could weigh it against what I was giving up. And what I was giving up was agency, the actual ability to change things. The second was starting small. And I mean proper small, embarrassingly small. After years of this, you can't rebuild agency through massive actions. Your brain won't believe it. It needs evidence that your action produces results. And for that evidence to land, the actions have to be in domain you actually control completely. I started by making my bed every morning. That's it. Not because tidy beds change your life. Because I needed proof to myself, properly, that I could decide to do something and then do it every single day. Proof that my actions were real. After 30 days of that, I added one more thing, then another. The habit formation research on this is actually interesting. The real time for a behavior to become automatic is around 66 days on average, not 21 like everyone says, and the range is massive. Simple habits might stick in 3 weeks. Complex ones can take 8 or 9 months. Rebuilding eternal locus of control is essentially building a new habitual response to obstacles. You're not going to flip a switch, you're going to practice it repeatedly until your external attribution stops being your brain's default. Third thing was the reframe, and this is specific language that matters. When you catch yourself in a victim narrative, when you notice you're blaming circumstances, the question isn't what should I have done differently? That creates shame, and shame isn't useful here. The question is, what can I control moving forward? Not backwards, forward. That's the cognitive reappraisal piece. You're not denying that situation was difficult or that real obstacles exist. And they do. I'm not pretending circumstances are always fair. What you're doing is redirecting the question from who is responsible for this to what can I actually do? Viktor Frankl, who survived circumstances that make most of our complaints look embarrassing, wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is freedom. That's not positivity, that's documented psychological reality. The actual system week by week. Week 1. Identify your secondary gains, write them down, everything victim mentality is giving you, and be honest with yourself. This isn't about judging yourself, it's about seeing clearly. Week 2 and 3. Choose one domain you completely control. Sleep schedule, exercise, how you respond to emails, something small, measurable, and completely yours. Track your follow-through daily, not to feel good about yourself, to just build evidence. Week 4 through 8. Add one more controllable behavior every 2 weeks. Don't rush this. Your brain needs time to internalize that your actions produce results. Behavioral activation, the act of doing things that prove agency, has to compound slowly or it doesn't stick. Week 9 through 12. One victim narrative, consciously reframed per week. When you catch external attributions happening, when you notice you're explaining a failure with circumstances, pause. Ask the forward question. What can I control from here? By week 12, and I can only speak to what happened for me, obstacles started feeling different. Not smaller, just different. They stopped being proof of helplessness and started feeling like problems. And problems have solutions. Helplessness doesn't. That's the shift. I'm not saying I've got this completely sorted. No. I still catch it sometimes. A bad week and the old patterns are right there, ready. But I know what's happening now. And knowing what's happening means I can ask the right questions instead of just sinking.